The stale air in the community hall hung heavy, thick with unspoken judgment. John Bunyan, a man whose worn suit spoke of humble living, stood before a congregation that felt less like a gathering of believers and more like a jury. He was talking about the fruit of the Spirit, a concept that seemed to float harmlessly above most heads, until Mr. Thorne decided to bring it crashing down. Mr. Thorne, a man whose expensive watch gleamed under the fluorescent lights, sat in the third row, a smirk playing on his lips. His posture was too relaxed, too confident. As Bunyan spoke of self-control, of patience and kindness, Thorne shifted. He cleared his throat, a loud, deliberate sound that cut through the quiet. "Excuse me, Pastor Bunyan," Thorne drawled, his voice carrying easily across the room. "But isn't this self-control just another word for weakness, for holding back? True strength, I believe, lies in action, in making things happen, in influence, not in some spirit fruit." He let out a small derisive laugh, and a few people in the congregation nervously chuckled along, his eyes, cold and sharp, fixed on Bunyan. "Your simple life, your unwavering faith, Pastor, it seems to me like a naive delusion, a way to cope when you can't truly achieve anything in the real world." Thorne's words were a punch, meant to sting, to diminish. Bunyan didn't flinch. He absorbed the insult, his gaze steady. For a brief moment he bowed his head, a private gesture. A flicker of something deep and unreadable passed through his eyes, like a distant storm. Then he raised his head, his face now etched with a quiet resolve, a strength that wasn't loud but deeply rooted. "Indeed, Mr. Thorne," Bunyan said, his voice calm, clear, and without a trace of anger. "The harvest of the Spirit takes time to ripen, but ripen it shall." A hush fell over the room, heavier than before. Thorne, momentarily caught off guard by Bunyan's composure, scoffed. He waved a dismissive hand, as if swatting away a fly. "Whatever you say, Pastor." He leaned back, crossing his arms, clearly believing he had won this round. But in the back, a young man named Alex, whose eyes carried the tired weight of a long struggle with addiction, looked up. He had been slumped in his seat, half listening, half lost in his own battles. Bunyan's quiet strength, the way he met Thorne's scorn with such unwavering peace, sparked something in Alex, a tiny seed of hope, a question mark hovering over Thorne's confident dismissal. The idea that there might be a different kind of strength, one not measured by wealth or power, began to form in his mind. Bunyan concluded the service, his final words echoing in the silence Thorne had inadvertently created. "For every seed sown, a harvest awaits, and some harvests are more bitter than others." The camera lingered on Mr. Thorne's face, still dismissive, still convinced of his own rightness. Then it shifted to Bunyan, whose gaze held a knowing depth, a quiet certainty that stretched far beyond the confines of the small hall. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us where you are watching from in the comments. The story of John Bunyan, the quiet preacher, wasn't just about that one Sunday service. To really get it, you had to go back, way back, to his early days in rural America. He grew up in a small town, the kind where everyone knew everyone, and life moved to the rhythm of the seasons. Farms dotted the landscape, their fields stretching out under wide open skies. Faith was the backbone of the community, woven into daily life like the threads in a homespun blanket. Sundays were for church, weekdays for honest work, and evenings for family stories around the hearth. Young John, even then, was a serious kid. He believed deeply in the teachings, trying his best to live by them, but it wasn't always easy. He often felt this nagging self-doubt, a quiet worry that he wasn't quite good enough, not strong enough to resist the pull of what the world considered important. There was this constant pressure to fit in, to chase after what others saw as success. But deep down, John had a different dream. He wanted to truly embody what the Bible called the fruit of the Spirit. He wanted his life to be a living example of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and especially self-control. These weren't just words to him. They were the blueprint for a life well lived. Even back then, Mr. Thorne was a part of John's world, though he was older and already seemed to have a firm grasp on the kind of life John sometimes felt he was supposed to want. Thorne represented something different, the shine of material success, a way of looking at life that was all about being practical, getting ahead. He had a way of subtly, almost unconsciously, making John's earnestness feel a little bit naive, a little bit out of touch. Thorne's family was well established, with a certain amount of influence in the town. Their prosperity was often whispered about, held up as a standard. It was a stark contrast to John's family, who were good, honest folk, but without the same kind of worldly clout. This difference created a quiet tension for John. He saw how the community valued outward signs of wealth and achievement. He felt the unspoken judgment, the way people would sometimes compare his family's humble piety to the Thornes' obvious success. It was never said directly, but it was there, a shadow that followed him. This made it a constant struggle for John to stay true to his spiritual path. He had to fight against the current, against the temptation to compromise his beliefs for the sake of fitting in or gaining approval. This early dynamic, this subtle but persistent pressure from the world Thorne represented, was already setting the stage for the bigger conflicts that would come later. It was more than just two individuals. It was two different ways of looking at life, two different definitions of what it meant to be strong and successful, slowly heading for a collision. John learned early on that living by the fruit of the Spirit would not be the easy path. It would require a strength that few understood, a quiet resilience that went against the grain of what many in his community admired. This early struggle was crucial. It forged the man who would stand firm years later against Mr. Thorne's public mockery, already seasoned by a lifetime of choosing a different kind of harvest. That early struggle was indeed crucial, shaping John in ways he couldn't have fully understood at the time. The seeds of future conflict were sown not in a single dramatic event, but in a series of smaller, almost imperceptible moments, each one adding to the quiet pressure John felt. Looking back, he could trace a pattern of Mr. Thorne's subtle dismissals, a constant chipping away at John's spiritual endeavors. It wasn't always outright opposition, but a more insidious kind of undermining. Thorne, even in his younger days, had a knack for making promises of support for community projects John led, particularly those with a spiritual bent. He would express enthusiasm, nod along at meetings, and offer his help, making John feel like they were on the same team. But then, when it came time to deliver, Thorne would subtly withdraw. A promised donation would shrink, a volunteer commitment would evaporate, or his help would be so minimal and performative that it ended up being more of a hindrance. It made John look less effective, less capable, in the eyes of the community. People would notice Thorne's name on the list of supporters, but then see the project struggle, and a quiet question mark would hang over John's leadership. Thorne would then offer veiled compliments, things like, "John, you've got such a pure heart, always thinking of others, but sometimes you need a little more practicality." Or, "It's admirable, John, that you prioritize spiritual things, but in this world, money talks, doesn't it?" These weren't outright insults, but they always subtly highlighted John's perceived lack of worldly ambition or financial success, making his earnest efforts seem a bit foolish. Thorne also knew how to use his family's influence. He would often manipulate community decisions, always subtly, to favor his own business interests. This often meant sidelining initiatives that John believed would genuinely benefit the community's spiritual well-being. For instance, John might propose a new community garden to teach stewardship and provide for the needy, while Thorne would push for a zoning change that benefited his construction company, even if it meant sacrificing a potential community space. Thorne would present his case with smooth talk and a focus on progress and economic growth, making John's more spiritually minded proposals seem quaint or unrealistic. There were also instances where Thorne would spread rumors, never directly, but always effectively. A whispered comment here, a knowing glance there, a strategically placed question about John's motives or his family's finances. He'd never say, "John is dishonest," but he might ask, "Is it true John's finances are a bit tight? I hope he's not mixing church funds with personal ones, for his own sake, of course." These rumors, planted like weeds, would take root in the community, subtly discrediting John's character in community gatherings. He would hear whispers, feel cold shoulders, and see hesitant looks, but could never pinpoint the source or directly confront the accusation because it was always so vague, so deniable. John always tried to respond with grace, to embody the patience and gentleness he preached. He told himself that Thorne was simply a worldly man, that his actions stemmed from a different worldview, but each incident, each subtle slight, each broken promise, left a tiny crack in John's emotional armor. He learned to expect it, to brace himself for Thorne's particular brand of calculated disrespect. The public mockery John endured in Part 1 wasn't an isolated incident, a sudden outburst from Thorne. No, it was the culmination of years of this calculated disrespect, a deep-seated contempt for John's faith-driven life that had been simmering beneath the surface all along. It was the final blow after a long history of subtle emotional erosion, a public declaration of a battle that, for Thorne, had been raging for years in the quiet corners of their shared community. John knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this was just the latest and most blatant manifestation of Thorne's true feelings. The emotional atmosphere in the small town grew heavy, almost suffocating. John's sermons, now delivered in the struggling church, often met with a quiet apathy from some members. Others showed outright disdain, their opinions clearly swayed by Thorne's ongoing, subtle campaign against John. It wasn't just in church either. Community discussions about local issues, things as simple as repairing the town hall or organizing a charity drive, often turned into veiled arguments. Thorne would push his pragmatic, financially driven solutions, while John would gently guide towards choices that considered spiritual well-being and genuine community benefit. More often than not, Thorne's side won out, his influence casting a long shadow. John felt the weight of social pressure pressing down on him. People, even some folks he'd known his whole life, started suggesting he needed to modernize his ministry. They'd say things like, "John, maybe a louder band would bring in the young crowd," or "Wouldn't a bigger, flashier building help attract more people?" These suggestions, always delivered with a smile and a pat on the back, often echoed Thorne's earlier criticisms, making John feel outdated and ineffective. Neighbors, and even a few of his own family members, started to subtly imply that his approach was old-fashioned, that he wasn't keeping up with the times. It was a constant, low-level hum of doubt in the background of his life. Thorne, seeing his influence grow, became more and more confident in his attacks. He started openly questioning John's financial stability, making comments about the church's dwindling donations and the relevance of John's teachings in a fast-paced world. He'd frame it as concern, saying things like, "I just worry about John. He works so hard, but his message just doesn't seem to resonate with people these days." But beneath the veneer of concern was a sharp, calculated edge. He didn't stop there. Thorne began actively recruiting members away from John's small congregation. He'd host community events at his own properties, offering secular alternatives for people looking for connection. Picnic lunches, youth sports leagues, business networking dinners, all designed to pull people away from the church and towards Thorne's sphere of influence. John saw members, people he had baptized and counseled, slowly drift away, drawn by the allure of Thorne's more modern and successful offerings. Each departure was a quiet stab, a confirmation of the community's shifting loyalties. He tried to understand it, to find fault in himself, but the constant erosion of his congregation felt like a personal failure. A profound sense of isolation began to settle over John. He felt emotionally suffocated, like the air was being slowly squeezed out of him. He'd wake up in the morning with a knot in his stomach, the perception that his life's work, his calling, was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece. The sting of judgment came from all sides, from the apathy of some, the disdain of others, and the quiet suggestions from those who claimed to care. He often found himself praying for strength, for guidance, for just a moment of peace from the relentless pressure. This was the peak of his internal struggle, a dark and heavy period where he questioned everything he believed in, before a decisive shift in his perspective finally began to take hold. He knew something had to give. He couldn't keep going like this. One Tuesday evening, after a particularly draining day, John was sitting in his small office at the church when there was a hesitant knock on the door. It was Mark, a young man in his mid-20s who had been attending Thorne's community events more often than church lately. Mark looked nervous, his eyes darting around the room before he finally spoke. He confessed to John that Mr. Thorne had been actively spreading false rumors about John's character and financial mismanagement within the community. Mark had heard it directly from Thorne himself, who had painted John as irresponsible and out of touch. The words hit John with a cold, hard truth. It wasn't just apathy or shifting loyalties. It was a deliberate campaign of sabotage. Mark explained that Thorne's motivation stemmed from a deep-seated resentment. Thorne felt that John's unwavering faith, despite his humble circumstances, still commanded a respect that Thorne's vast wealth and influence could not buy. Thorne saw John's quiet dignity, his commitment to the fruit of the Spirit, as a direct challenge to his own worldly values, and his belief that success was measured only by material gain. Mark said Thorne would often mock the idea of spiritual fruit behind closed doors, calling it a crutch for the weak, while secretly seething that John, with so little, seemed to possess something Thorne, with so much, desperately lacked. This revelation, while devastating, didn't break John. Instead, it solidified something within him. He realized that passive endurance was no longer enough. Turning the other cheek had its place, but there was a point where injustice had to be confronted. He understood that he must actively embody the fruit of the Spirit, not just in his personal life, in his quiet prayers and his gentle guidance, but also in standing up for what was right, in confronting this calculated deceit. He decided he would publicly address Thorne's actions, but not with anger or a desire for retribution. His aim would be to expose the truth, to call out the darkness with light, and to do so in a way that truly reflected the principles he preached. Coincidentally, around the same time this confession came to light, whispers started circulating about Mr. Thorne. It seemed he was facing a significant personal and financial crisis. The details were murky, but people were talking about bad investments, a major deal that had fallen through, and even some legal troubles related to his business practices. It hinted at the instability of his worldly foundations, the very foundations he had built his life and influence upon. The man who had always seemed invincible, whose wealth had been his shield, was suddenly looking vulnerable. This combined situation presented an unexpected opportunity for John. He could now expose the truth of Thorne's character and actions, not through angry accusations, but by drawing a stark contrast. He could show the community the difference between worldly ambition, built on deceit and manipulation, and spiritual integrity, even in the face of adversity. This moment was a breaking point, a chance to shatter the cycle of quiet suffering and shift the narrative. It was time for the fruit of the Spirit to truly show its strength. John felt a churning mix of fear and a righteous anger after deciding to confront Thorne. The thought of standing against such a powerful man, a figure who had held sway over their community for so long, made his stomach clench. He grappled with doubts. Would his approach be effective, or would it simply fuel more conflict, making him seem petty or vengeful, the very opposite of what he preached? He wanted to act with spiritual integrity, but the human desire to defend himself, to strike back at the injustice, was a strong pull. The young man, Mark, who had revealed Thorne's actions, quickly became John's staunchest ally. Mark, now free from the burden of Thorne's manipulation, offered not just support, but further evidence. He brought John copies of old emails, whispered conversations he'd overheard, and even a few financial records that hinted at Thorne's less-than-ethical business dealings. Mark's conviction that John was doing the right thing was a steadying force for John, helping him push past his own anxieties. The community, however, reacted in varied and predictable ways. Some, previously swayed by Thorne's charm and influence, began to question his motives. They remembered past instances of his subtle manipulations, the way he'd always come out on top, often at someone else's expense. A seed of doubt, once planted, now started to sprout. Others, however, remained fiercely loyal to Thorne. These were often people whose businesses depended on Thorne's patronage or whose social standing was intertwined with his family's reputation. They became openly hostile towards John, whispering behind his back, avoiding his gaze, and sometimes even making snide remarks about his holier-than-thou attitude. The deep-seated American cultural value of reputation and social standing came into sharp focus. For many, Thorne represented success, stability, and the established order. His supporters, fearing social ostracization or financial repercussions if they sided with John, initially rallied around Thorne. They saw John's actions as an attack on their way of life, on the very fabric of their community's power structure. This created a palpable tension, a thick, uncomfortable silence whenever John entered a room, a sense of unspoken sides being taken. In a moment of profound spiritual conviction, John decided to address the situation head-on, but not in a confrontational way. He chose the pulpit, his familiar ground, to deliver a powerful sermon. He spoke on the difference between worldly success and true spiritual wealth. He talked about integrity, about character, about the quiet strength that comes from living a life guided by principles, even when it's difficult. He never named Thorne, never pointed fingers, but his words were a mirror. He spoke of building foundations on sand versus building them on rock, of the fleeting nature of material gain compared to the lasting value of a pure heart. He spoke of the fruit of the Spirit, not as a weakness, but as the ultimate strength, a shield against deceit and a beacon of truth. This sermon served as an emotional explosion. It forced the community to confront uncomfortable truths, to look inward at their own values and priorities. The division deepened, but it was no longer a quiet, simmering tension. It was out in the open. John felt the immense psychological weight of standing against such a powerful figure. The sleepless nights, the constant scrutiny, the feeling of being judged by every eye in the room took its toll. But alongside this burden, he also felt a renewed sense of purpose. He understood that his faith was now being tested in the crucible of public scrutiny, and that this was precisely where it needed to be. His message, once whispered, was now a roar, echoing through the hearts of those who truly listened. John, having laid bare the spiritual choices before his community, now began the slow, deliberate work of re-establishing his ministry. He didn't do this by attacking Thorne further or by dwelling on the past. Instead, he simply lived out the fruit of the Spirit in tangible, everyday ways. He organized community cleanup days, not just for physical spaces, but for broken relationships. He started a small, free tutoring program for children struggling in school, using his own humble home as a classroom. He held open prayer meetings where anyone, regardless of their past allegiances, was welcome to share their burdens and find solace. These initiatives, born of genuine compassion and a desire for true spiritual growth, began to attract those who had grown disillusioned by Thorne's shallow materialism. People saw the difference between empty promises and real action, between influence bought with money and respect earned through integrity. Meanwhile, Mr. Thorne's carefully constructed world started to fall apart. His personal and financial crisis, which had been brewing beneath the surface, deepened rapidly. The lack of true character, which his wealth and influence had long masked, became glaringly apparent. Business ventures that once seemed solid now unraveled, exposed as built on shaky foundations of unethical practices and shady deals. Loans he had secured through dubious means were called in, and his creditors, no longer intimidated by his dwindling power, came knocking. His social standing, once unassailable, crumbled as the community saw through his facade. The whispers that had once followed John now turned to Thorne, growing louder and more insistent. He faced legal repercussions for some of his past manipulations, not because John pursued them, but because the truth, once exposed, had a way of finding justice on its own. Thorne, stripped of his worldly power, found himself utterly isolated. His former allies vanished, his family ties strained by his disgrace. He was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own making. In a quiet, unexpected moment, John approached Thorne, not with triumph, but with a simple, genuine offer of help. It wasn't an offer to fix Thorne's problems, but an olive branch of forgiveness, a quiet demonstration of the fruit of love. John didn't condone Thorne's actions, nor did he forget the pain they had caused, but he extended a hand, embodying the very principles Thorne had so vehemently rejected. Thorne, humbled and utterly broken, was unable to speak. He simply nodded, a flicker of something new in his eyes, perhaps shame, perhaps regret, perhaps even a nascent form of repentance. His full transformation was left open-ended, reflecting the complexities of real life, the long, arduous path towards change that often follows rock bottom. John's ministry, now free from the shadows of Thorne's influence, truly began to flourish, built on authenticity and genuine spiritual connection. His small church became a beacon of hope, a place where people found not just sermons, but true community, support, and a pathway to living a more meaningful life. The story concluded with John, standing on the porch of his now vibrant church, reflecting on the profound truth that the fruit of the Spirit was not merely a list of virtues to aspire to. It was a powerful, transformative force, a quiet strength that ultimately triumphed over worldly ambition, deceit, and the empty promises of material gain. His journey, from a humble preacher facing public mockery to a respected spiritual leader, served as a testament to the enduring power of faith and the quiet, unwavering strength found in living a life guided by divine principles. It was a life that proved that true harvest, though it takes time to ripen, is always worth the wait.